Hello and welcome to the Just Culture Spotlight webinar series. This is the third in this series that we've been doing. We're doing this once a month. In this series, we cover various aspects of just culture, safety management, human factors. It's an opportunity to get some information on some of that stuff and also to ask questions on anything just culture, safety management related. Today, we're going to be talking about the bridging the gap between law and safety, and really talking about some of the opportunities and challenges involved in using just culture to achieve regulatory compliance with safety regulations, and also a chance to answer some questions around that topic. So I say this is the third in the series that we've done. If you'd like to view any of the previous webinars, they're available on our YouTube page and also through the Just Culture Consulting website as well under the resources section. So you can check those out there. This session is being recorded, so and as well as the live stream, so it'll go up on those platforms afterwards. If you aren't able to be here for the whole time, you'll be able to catch up later. The format for today is I'll spend 20-25 minutes talking about some various aspects of this topic, and then we'll do sort of 5-10 minutes of Q&A at the end. But as we go, if you have any questions, feel free to post those in the comments. I'll try and keep an eye on the comment section, and if I can, I'll answer a question as we go. Otherwise, I'll go through the questions at the end. All right, there's a bunch of stuff that I wanted to dive into today, so we should probably get started. When we're talking about legal compliance when it comes to safety, obviously the specifics of it will vary depending on what jurisdiction you're in, what industry you're in, what kind of operations that your organisation does, and there'll obviously be specific rules that will apply depending on all of that. But in general, when it comes to safety management and meeting legal obligations, there are really, I think, so two main components to it. The first is the need to have proper systems in place to manage workplace hazards, to ensure the work health and safety of your workers and anyone else who might be affected by the operations that you're doing, which could be customers, auditors, the general public, if they're in and around the activities that you're doing. So proper systems. Now, those systems might be documented to a large degree. They might be largely undocumented. They might take the form of complex software packages with apps and all sorts. It could be post-it notes. It could be verbal instructions. Obviously the nature of the system will depend on the size, the scope, the complexity of your operations, any specific regulatory requirements that you might have. But they can take different forms, but fundamentally they need to be proper. They need to be appropriate for what the type of operations, the type of work that you're doing. So one, having proper systems in place. And then the second is for the organisation to exercise due diligence to ensure and demonstrate that those systems are effective, that they actually are achieving the objective of managing safety, of managing those workplace hazards. And this is something that where a lot of organisations fall down, is that they have systems in place, but those systems are not effective, perhaps because they're not actually being used, or because people aren't trained properly to use those systems, or they're not a good fit for the organisation. So, if you have an organisation where workers understand the hazards that are involved, that are associated with their work, and where there are appropriate controls in place, and the workers understand those controls, and those controls are usually well applied, you're going a long way to achieving regulatory compliance. Because generally speaking, workplace regulators are less interested in how you achieve good management of workplace hazards, but it's outcomes. It's, are you actually doing it, and can you demonstrate that your systems are effective? So I want to turn now to Just Culture and the opportunities that Just Culture brings to achieving regulatory compliance when it comes to safety. So the first part of that is to say that Just Culture is one part of that system that you have to manage safety, to manage those workplace hazards. And it does, and it's part of that system in a number of different ways. The first, which is really, really important, is an obligation to provide organisational justice. So that Just Culture provides a framework and an underpinning for ensuring that things like your incident investigations, the way that you manage workplace conflict, the way that you deal with manage situations when things go wrong, that is done in a just and fair way, both in terms of the outcomes that you are providing just and fair outcomes, but also that your processes are just and fair. Your investigative process is fair for everyone concerned. And also at a very basic level, that you are not unfairly punishing workers for system-induced errors. It's one of the fundamental principles of Just Culture, and it's something that if you have an obligation to provide organisational justice, which most organisations do have that obligation, which comes in one form or another, Just Culture goes a long way to help you achieving that. Also, obligations to manage other types of psychosocial risks. Now, certainly in Australia now, we have specific work health and safety regulations and requirements for managing psychosocial risks. And these are things like high workload or low workload, exposure to traumatic events, things like bullying, harassment, sexual harassment, hazardous working environments that might evoke a psychological or stress response, such as like remote or isolated work. So there's a whole range of different things that kind of come under that scope of psychosocial risks, but generally it's a requirement to ensure the mental health and safety of your workers, not just their physical health and safety. Now, this is obviously mainly specifically an Australian requirement, but even overseas there are increasingly moves by work health and safety regulators to bring in requirements for protections of mental health and safety, not just physical. And when it comes to psychosocial risks, these are the kinds of things that, like, unlike many physical hazards that you can see through observations or site tours, you can, a lot of physical risks, you can see, oh, that person's not wearing a harness when they're working at heights, or those loads aren't secure. You can observe those things. Whereas psychosocial hazards rely on people speaking up and telling you, that they're being harassed, or that they're overloaded, or saying, I'm worried about this procedure that we have because it's stressing me out because I don't feel safe. So if you're not then creating an environment where people feel empowered to speak up, to raise issues, to admit mistakes, then you're not going to be able to effectively manage psychosocial risks because you're not going to know about them, which is obviously not good, both for safety and also is now a serious legal risk. And so this is really where Just Culture comes in. It's your primary vehicle for building a culture where people can speak up, where they can trust that they're not going to be punished for raising issues or admitting mistakes, and that the organisation will look to learn about where they can make changes at the system level to improve future performance. If there are obligations to consult workers on work health and safety issues, which they certainly are in Australia and frequently overseas as well, again, just culture is part of that system of consultation. So it goes alongside things like toolbox talks and other types of measures that you might have for consultation. And it's both the direct reporting systems. Just culture can help to underpin those, but it also makes your other types of consultation more effective, because you're creating an environment where people can actually, as I say, speak up and raise issues in those forums. So that your consultation becomes more than just box ticking, and actually is effective and meaningful, which is really, really important. Obligations to deal appropriately with things like misconduct, such as sexual harassment, for example. Just culture is not a get out of jail free card. It's about retaining standards of mutual accountability, both for the individual in the organisation and for the organisation itself, when it comes to the systems of work in which it designs and operates. And so this is really important for managing risks of things like bullying and harassment. Certainly in Australia, these are not just HR issues anymore, they are safety issues. And so accountability, as long as it's both just and fair, in both its standards and in how it's applied, is vitally important for building high-performing teams. And so having a just culture where you can distinguish that line between acceptable and unacceptable behavior, and where your staff have been involved in co-creating that line, means that you're in a much better place to have accountability for things like misconduct, which is a requirement for organisations to have. So that's the sort of the systems part of how just culture fits in with your safety systems. Just culture is also a vital tool and provides opportunities in ascertaining whether your safety systems are effective. So firstly, in particular around reporting, and are your procedures being followed? And if not, why not? A just culture, if you have a just culture a framework that is effective in your organization, then when people are in a situation where they divert from procedures, they are much more likely to speak up and say, hey, I had to divert from our procedure, and here's why: because the equipment that we would normally use wasn't available, and this task had to be completed. And so it gives the organisation the opportunity then to go, oh, okay, yes, we've got an issue here with our equipment. Let's fix it so that the next time this situation arises, the worker isn't forced to divert from the procedures. If you don't have a just culture, if you take a punitive type of approach, then what's often going to happen is that people will hide diversions from procedures. And of course, if it's being hidden, you can't manage it. And the easiest case for a prosecutor to make is you had procedures and you didn't follow them. And so if you've got your written procedures all set out, but you've got a situation where they're regularly not being followed, and management is not aware of it, that is a prosecution or a lawsuit waiting to happen. So just culture is a really important tool there to create that environment where people can speak up about these sorts of things. When it comes to this idea of ensuring that our systems are effective, and there's a number of ways that we can do that. There's observation, and sort of direct supervision, but of course, usually we can't be there, or management can't be there all the time. And if we're appointing supervisors to conduct that supervision, are they giving the correct instructions, or are they instructing workers to divert from procedures, for example, to get the job done? Again, a just culture, establishing open communication and relationships of trust makes it much more likely that you're going to be aware of how the work is actually being done and being able to address the issues associated with that. I mean, there are other options in terms of, there's obviously, workplace surveillance, which I don't really tend to recommend, because it tends to be, it demonstrates that you lack trust, and that damage of trust, I think, causes more problems than it solves. Another part of Just Culture's tool for ensuring that safety systems are effective is through hazard reporting. Obviously, if you are going to have an effective hazard reporting system, workers need the opportunities to report. So the systems need to be there. They need the capacity to report. So they need the training in what to report and how, but also the motivation to report. And that motivation is, and this is where the Just Culture really comes in, is dealing with those sort of issues around, well, if I report, am I going to get in trouble? If I report this thing, am I going to be branded a troublemaker? Is it going to be welcomed? Should I actually bother reporting, because is anything actually going to change? A well-functioning Just Culture framework where you are welcoming reports, where you are closing the loop so people actually hear something back, and where people see meaningful change coming from reports being made, makes your hazard identification process much more effective, and that's vital for ensuring that your safety controls are effective. And then on as well, human factors investigations of incidents, looking at where the systems, failed. Just Culture creates that foundation to be able to run those kinds of investigations where you're going beyond human error and you're looking at the systems. All right, so those are the opportunities. What about the challenges? One that comes up very often is this perception that Just Culture lacks accountability, that it's a get-out-of-jail-free card. And so in the face of demands from the regulators and the public, you might get to hold someone accountable after an incident. You need to be able to explain accountability in under Just Culture. And I think I think that Just Culture is not a way of escaping accountability. I think Just Culture actually both broadens and deepens accountabilities. It broadens out accountability not just to the frontline worker, the last person to touch the machine, but to the organisation itself in terms of the systems in place and how they operated. And it's also about deepening accountability as far as you are forward accountability. The organisation is taking on accountability to proactively look for safety issues and to make changes to the system to make it less likely that a similar event is going to happen in future. So rather than a sole focus on what happened and whose fault was it, but rather how we're going to fix things in the future to make our systems safer. And so being prepared in advance to talk about accountability under Just Culture, this is our approach and why. And to show how you've implemented mutual accountability in the past and how that's led to safer outcomes goes a long way to addressing that perception. Another challenge is that often you might have specific laws in your jurisdiction that may prevent you running your Just Culture framework in the way that you might like. So, for example, in many industries, there are mandatory reporting obligations of certain events to regulators. Now, that can be a very good thing. It can be a very important safety and regulatory tool. But if you have a very punitive regulator, sometimes as an organisation, you might want to take a Just Culture approach to a situation, but you know that you have to report this incident to a punitive regulator who may well take adverse action against, say, your frontline employee in a way that you might not like. It's tricky in terms of dealing with that situation. It is difficult. I would say, one, make sure that you are upfront with your workers about the challenges and limitations. To saying like we've got our Just Culture approach. but these are the limitations of which it operates because of these legal requirements that we have. So it's really important not to make promises that you can't keep, and to keep staff informed about what protections they do and don't have, and under what circumstances. The second thing I would say is back up your staff as much as you can. Don't throw them to the wolves. Especially not to save your own skin. Provide emotional support for staff. If you have to put staff on leave because of regulatory action, provide that emotional support. Check in with them. Provide them with legal support if you can. And in some cases, maybe advocate to the regulator and say, look, we don't think the way that this is being dealt with is appropriate. Here's a better alternative that is based around forward accountability and learning rather than punitive. So you're not necessarily going to be able to solve that situation, in a perfect way, but do what you can to support your staff. Probably the biggest challenge, though, I think, is around the fact that post-incident investigations can expose legal liability or impact insurance for organisations. And so, if you are, for anyone who's been involved with safety, for any length of time, we know that from the research and that most safety incidents, if not all of them, have their origins in organizational factors. And so then if we are doing post-incident investigations of minor incidents or near misses and things like that, the risk is that if we are doing a quality safety investigation, bringing in human factors and so on, that we are going to identify issues with the organizational systems, and therefore paint the target on our back. We're creating a library of evidence that a prosecutor or a plaintiff lawyer can then use against the organisation. So how can we deal with that situation? First is the reality that, there are often legal obligations to investigate and report certain incidents, such as under Australian work health and safety law, if you have a near miss where there was a real risk of injury, serious injury or death or serious damage to equipment, there's usually a mandatory report to the work health and safety regulator. So the question then becomes, if you've got to report these things anyway, then finding out about them and understanding them and fixing the issues, you may as well do that because you're going to be reporting it to the regulator anyway. The other thing to say is that where you have where this sort of risk is greatest is where you have collected information about near misses or previous incidents, ways in which your systems have not been working well, and then they haven't been addressed, and the issues are continuing. Well, if you are addressing those issues, if you're being proactive, if you're improving your system, that significantly reduces that risk. The other thing to say is, of course, that if we're not doing those things, we're foregoing the benefits of forward accountability. If you look at, say, the healthcare sector, hospitals, if there's been say a bad outcome out of an operation, there have been studies that have shown multiple times that if the hospital talks to the patient or their family and explains what happened, explains say an error that was made, but then commits to addressing the harm that's been caused, but also involves that the patient and their family with how the hospital was going to change its systems in future to make it unlikely that this error or this outcome is going to happen again. That significantly reduces the chance of there being a lawsuit out of that incident. And it also reduces the chance of regulators taking action as well, because if you have an organisation that is proactively addressing a situation, that is making changes to improve its systems, for a regulator, there is less need to deter that organisation because they're already making those changes. Doesn't mean that you could now. Doesn't mean that they won't be regulatory action, but it reduces the chance that there will be. You may have to gently challenge excessive caution and fear amongst your lawyers and insurers. Now, lawyers and insurers, they're trained to see all the ways and ways things can go wrong. And sometimes you might need to push them to be a bit creative. You know, after all, in aviation and oil and gas, they do these kinds of incident investigations and to improve their systems. And their lawyers and insurers see the safety benefits of it. So it's a balancing of that short-term protection for the organisation versus long-term safety. And so engage in that discussion with your legal and insurance advisors. There may be more scope there than what you might initially think. Having said all of that, if there is a death or serious injury, you know, you've had a major event in your organisation, it may well be that you need to apply different procedures where you are going to put protection of the organisation front and centre because these kind of events can present existential risks to the organisation. And so you might need to prioritise that above learning, at least in the short term. Now, so you might have different procedures in place for those kind of situations, and you want to make sure that your workers know that in advance and know what protections they have and what to do. And in particular, that it's not a case, hopefully, of the organisation protecting itself at the expense of the workers, but how the workers are protected as part of that whole picture. So you want to think that through. Now, there is unfortunately sometimes a tendency for, if you're trying to defend a workplace prosecution, to say, well, it was all the workers' fault. Our systems were fine. It was the worker on their own that caused the issue. And sometimes that, and there are some instances where that kind of defense can work. Try and avoid that dilemma if you can. Have a think about the strength of your case, because the worst case scenario is is that you defend the action in that way and you are found liable anyway, and you've damaged trust with your workforce for no discernible gain. So you want to think about before going down that path. Now, sometimes that might be your best option, but again, you want to really think about it carefully before you go down that path. Another tip you can use is to use, particularly when they sign serious incidents, is to engage your lawyers to conduct the safety, well, not conduct, but to commission the safety investigation so that it's protected by legal professional privilege. That means that that report into that incident is then protected from being used by prosecutors and so on, and plaintiffs and so on. The downside is that it means it has to be kept confidential, which means you can't necessarily distribute it and learn from it as much as you would like to, at least until the legal situation is resolved. But that is one avenue you can use so that you can at least, it's better than nothing, even if it is limited. But you want to be upfront with your workers about the challenges and the limitations. At the end of the day, though, it really comes down to the kind of organisation that you want to be. Is it one where you wait for accidents to happen and then you put up walls to protect from the fallout? Or is it one where you proactively seek out information, find the safety gaps and fill them, and balance out long and short-term protective measures for the organisation? All right, I realise I've spoken a little bit over time. I will address any questions that people have, but for those of you who know it's 1 o'clock, who might need to go, thank you for joining us. I hope you found this helpful. Our next webinar will be on the 28th of February at 12:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time. So same time as today, and that's going to be on avoiding common pitfalls with Just Culture. So common mistakes that people fall into and how we can avoid those. If you have any questions or suggestions for a future webinar or any questions about Just Culture, you can go to our website, www.justculture.com.au/ask-questions. You can fill out the form there and ask your question. You can choose whether you want to put contact information there or not. But if you do, we can get back to you with an answer on that, or we can make sure it's something that we cover in a future webinar. All right. I will see what questions we've got here for those of you who are able to stick around for a few more minutes. So there's one, how do we reconcile a systems-based safety investigation with the need to investigate individual misconduct? Yeah, it's a really great question. I think there's a couple of ways that you can approach this. One is, so under a Just Culture approach, you are assuming, you have a presumption that people come to work intending to do a good job. And that unless and until you find evidence to the contrary, you will make that presumption. So that if you have an incident that you are investigating, and you're saying you're doing a learning review, for example, and you're making that assumption, then it's only then as you are doing that review that if it emerges that there is credible evidence of serious misconduct, that you might then have to transition from a safety investigation into a misconduct investigation. And obviously you want to be upfront with workers when that happens, and make sure that they know what their rights and obligations are and their protections are under each of those frameworks. And so you want to be, again, very careful that you're not making promises that you can't keep. So if you're talking about, you say you're doing a learning review and you're saying this is non-punitive, it's not going to be used against you, et cetera, well, you want to make sure that it's actually true before you make those kinds of statements. One approach would be to basically quarantine the learning review. So, right, we're going to transition now to a misconduct investigation. We're not going to use any information, anything that you said from the learning review. Now, whether you can do that depends on your jurisdiction and so on. Another way of approaching it, perhaps a better way of approaching it, is if you have co-created the line between acceptable and unacceptable behavior with your staff, and you've got buy-in with that, then your worker's going to know very well where that line is, and they're not necessarily going to be expecting to be protected, if you like, if they've engaged in conduct that they know is absolutely unacceptable. But that requires you to have had those conversations as you are developing your Just Culture framework, and that it is a co-creation process, not merely just a consultation process. But that's a really good question. So thank you for that one. All right. I think looks like that's, another question here from Ahmed. Workforce turnover and budget cuts could be some issues that become obstacles. How do you see that? Oh, I've just lost the, there we go. How do you see that? Another thing, are there any KPI to be used to ensure successful implementation? Yeah, I mean, so if we can try and keep that up on the screen if we can, so I can remember the whole question. But in terms, so workover turnover and budget cuts, I mean, it is, if we're talking about safety in general when it comes to budgets, that is always the fight that safety officers sort of have to have is advocating for an appropriate budget for safety within the organisation. And if you have a strong safety culture, particularly amongst the leadership, then they should be seeing safety as an investment and a core value, and something that is it helps the organisation not just be safer, but also have more reliable systems, produce more quality outcomes. But it's really, if there are resourcing issues, then if you've got a strong just culture, that should be also been getting picked up through your reporting system as well. But it really does rely on leadership buy-in on that one. Workforce turnover. I think having a strong just culture framework helps with workforce turnover, because if your workers feel like they're valued, that they can have influence in the organisation, that their inputs are valued and actually can affect change, that provides a lot more meaningfulness to work. And I think makes you less likely you're going to attract better talent, and I think and people who are going to want to stay in the organisation. So I think just culture can certainly help with workforce turnover. It's also obviously something that is a potential safety hazard, high workforce turnover, that needs to have risk controls associated with it. So that might be having redundancy, having procedures for people to step into roles and so on. On the issue about KPIs to ensure successful implementation, obviously, a number of things. If you are introducing just culture, you would want to see a uptick in reporting rates of hazards, of issues, of mistakes. So you'd be wanting to see that increase, at least in the short term. You would be looking for things like, okay, when you've been getting reports, has a reply gone to the worker? Have the issues that have been raised been appropriately addressed, and having KPIs for that? If you are doing just culture reviews after an incident, are you auditing those to check that the review has been conducted in accordance with your just culture framework, that you haven't just reverted back to blaming the worker or blaming the supervisor, that you've looked at the human factors, you've looked at the system, so that it's a measure of the quality of your just culture framework. There's a whole lot of other metrics you can use, but that's just a few of them. But yeah, great question. Thanks, Ahmed. All right. Let me see if there's any other questions here. Question from Marlon. What needs to change first, policies, investigations, or leadership behavior? I mean, they're all important, but I would definitely say leadership behavior. At the end of the day, cultural change is built through consistent behavior. And when you roll out a new measure, like say a just culture implementation, your workers are immediately going to be looking and going, okay, is this real? Is this something that the organisation is truly committed to? Or is this just a fad that given 6 months and, or is this just another piece of paper that we have to fill out? And so they're going to be looking for those signs that this is something that's real. And so that leadership behavior and leadership and commitment demonstrated through behavior, through consistent behavior, is vitally important for building a strong foundation for a just culture implementation. So I definitely would say, so yeah, leadership behavior is the starting point, that commitment. All right. Cool. I think then I don't see any other questions. And obviously we are over time. So I apologize for those of you if you're still here and I've taken up more of your time than intended. But I hope you have found this webinar helpful. I hope you'll join us next time. Like I say, if you have any questions about anything we've talked about today, please do visit the website and get in touch, or directly with me through LinkedIn, and we will get back to you. All right. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and I hope to see you next time.